Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today is the highly anticipated return of our yearly wide receiver tier list video. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be sharing statistics and my opinions regarding my top 40 wide receivers going into the 2022 fantasy football season. Now, before we start talking for the next hour long, of course, there's a lot of information to divulge. I want to go ahead and make a couple announcements. First and foremost, for those of you who have yet to do so, be sure to subscribe. We're making fantasy football content daily for the entirety of the 2022 season. So whether it is tier list videos, upcoming must draft videos, draft strategy videos for this offseason, going into the regular season where we'll have our weekly waiver wires, positional rankings, Sunday morning live streams, with the singular purpose of helping you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. So subscribe if you have not yet already. Help us reach our goal of 60,000 subscribers by this weekend, potentially crushing that, getting to 70, 80K this year. Thank you very much. Now, the second announcement I wanted to make before we begin is in regards to the information above my head. Again, besides Underdog Fantasy providing another access point for where you can go ahead and gain experience via drafts in their multitude of best ball tournaments this upcoming summer. But you could also go ahead and get a little bit extra when using promo code Andrew. If you go ahead and travel down to the description of the video and click on the link, when you use promo code Andrew and sign up and make a first-time deposit via Underdog Fantasy, not only will you get a first-time deposit match up to $100, you'll also get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings for a half and full PPR scoring format. Those rankings are by position, by tier, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, along with my top 200 flex. Those rankings are also updated weekly and sent to you every Saturday morning. So regardless of when you're drafting, whether it's August or early September, you're ready to help yourself win a 2022 fantasy football championship. Now, the final thing that I wanted to mention is in regards to the giveaway we're doing. For those of you who sign up and make a first-time deposit using promo code Andrew between August 25th and August 28th, you will be eligible for the drawing that I will be doing live on stream August 29th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time here on the channel. I will be spinning the wheel with your Underdog usernames on it for those of you who have signed up using the promo code Andrew, and 10 of you will be winning $50 of in-game Underdog cash. So why not take advantage of the opportunity on hand by drafting some teams, getting that first deposit match, getting my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings, and of course, we'll see you Monday night for the drawing. Thank you very much. All right, with that all mentioned, let's go ahead and let's begin with our wide receiver tier list for the 2022 fantasy football season. Again, like I mentioned yesterday, prior to the running back list beginning, majority of the players that are between S and C tier are guys that are at the top 12 of their position. Everything after that is going to be the biggest determining factor as to whether or not you are bringing home a 2022 fantasy football championship. Everyone is looking for this season's Cooper Kupp, Calvin Ridley, Chris Godwin. There are players out there that are going to have incredible seasons. It's just a matter of sifting through their statistics, finding the perfect opportunity, and picking the players that we believe have that incredible upside. So let's get into this, beginning with the man I just mentioned, Cooper Kupp, going into the 2022 fantasy football season. Listen, it's short, simple, sweet. He was incredible last season. Super Bowl champion, Super Bowl MVP, Triple Crown winner, most receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns by a wide receiver during the regular season last year. He had the most points amongst all options in fantasy, excluding quarterbacks, of course. But 367 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format is no joke. Not only that, he continued to set records. And yes, he was almost barely in the position to break, the most receptions in a season, the most receiving yards in a season, obviously due to that 17th game. But either way, in terms of some of the records he set last season, most games of 100 receiving yards in a year, 11. Most games of 100 receiving yards and a touchdown, 9. Most games of 7 or more receptions in a season, 15. I mean, he had a legendary year. And even if Cooper Kupp didn't score a single touchdown last season, he scored 16, by the way. Let's say, for example, he didn't score a single one. He would have still been the number 4 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. That's the kind of elite level production he put forth last season. Obviously, Matthew Stafford had the best statistical season of his career since 2011, and this offense is only going in the right direction in 2022. Defending champs, I believe in Cooper Kupp as the number 1 wide receiver. Moving on to our second S-tier wide receiver. Again, you guys knew it was coming. Justin Jefferson, in my opinion, is at the level of Cooper Kupp. For those of you who ask me in the comment section, Andrew, are you okay taking Justin Jefferson over Cooper Kupp? I'm perfectly fine with it. It's just a matter of what you can potentially expect to see in terms of overall upside. Now, Justin Jefferson in the first 2 seasons of his career has been incredible, averaging 17.53 half PPR fantasy points per game when he has played over 75% of the snaps and had Kirk Cousins under center. That's 27 of the last 33 games, which makes it 81% of the time. Now, speaking of Kirk Cousins, of course, he's going to take another step forward, despite the fact that over the last 2 years, he's at a minimum put up 4,200 passing yards and 33 passing touchdowns. Those numbers are only going to rise in 2022 because you're bringing in a brand new head coach, an offensive-minded head coach in Kevin O'Connell, the former quarterback coach of Kirk Cousins in Washington, a former offensive coordinator for the Los Angeles Rams, Super Bowl winning Los Angeles Rams last year. He's going to come in and make Justin Jefferson the Cooper Kupp of this offense, and that's why so many people are excited about the potential. Again, Justin Jefferson went from his rookie year being the number 6 overall wide receiver in fantasy to elevating that by an additional 46 fantasy points and becoming the number 4 overall wide receiver. Why not go ahead, add another 40 on top of that, and become the number 2 wide receiver in 2022? Moving on, we have Ja'Marr Chase, a former college teammate of Justin Jefferson back at LSU. I mean, Ja'Marr Chase came onto the scene last season and took over. The fact that he didn't even play football in 2020 at LSU, he just took the year off and then absolutely dominates in his rookie season. I mean, this is the second best rookie year outside of Randy Moss in, NFL history. You look at the stats, you look at the fantasy points in specific. I mean, these are better numbers than Odell Beckham Jr., Justin Jefferson. An incredible season to say the very least, and he's only going to build upon it going into this year. Again, with Joe Burrow under center, the chemistry that they have from college, the fact that the Cincinnati Bengals made it a point to overhaul this entire offensive line. You have 4 new starters on the line. You bring in a brand new left guard who's going to be a rookie, Ted Karras, a center from New England. You have Alex Kappa, the right guard from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Lyle Collins, of course, I'm sure the Dallas Cowboys would have loved to have him now that Tyron Smith is out, but Lyle Collins is going to be their starting right tackle. There is a lot of potential here for this offense and Joe Burrow to even go further beyond what he was able to produce last year, which was 4,600 passing yards and 34 passing touchdowns. I think Burrow could elevate to 5,040 touchdowns, which is only going to help Ja'Marr Chase's bottom line on a weekly basis. Now, he has Triple Crown aspirations. He wants to go ahead and achieve that. And a lot of that is going to have to do with touchdowns. Last season, he had 8 receiving touchdowns on receptions that were 20 or more yards down the field. Oftentimes, people look at those numbers and think, it's hard to duplicate, but we've seen Tyreek Hill and Antonio Brown both be able to accomplish that level of success in the deep passing game. So why not Ja'Marr Chase going into 2022? All right, let's talk about Stefon Diggs, the only other wide receiver I wanted to mention in the A tier. Of course, he is the number 1 receiving option of Josh Allen, one of the most explosive offenses in the entire National Football League. Now, since he arrived in Buffalo, he's been the number 3 and the number 7 overall wide receiver ranked in a half PPR scoring format. Now, a lot of that has had to do with the fact that he's been given ample opportunity. Again, 165 and 166 total targets in these first 2 years. Now, obviously averaging 10.03 targets per game, along with 15.12 half PPR fantasy points per game. It looks like Stefon Diggs is once again going to be an automatic success this year. And to add even more on top of that, the fact that there is no more Cole Beasley or Emmanuel Sanders in this offense, that opens up a potential of 182 targets that are now vacant. Now, obviously, we do expect Isaiah McKenzie, Jamison Crowder, Gabriel Davis, James Cook to get involved in the receiving game. But what if, in fact, Stefon Diggs takes another step forward? What if he goes ahead and adds another 20 targets onto his overall production? We're going to get him into this top 4 conversation. And I think even if he doesn't do that, he's in line to do so because the receptions are there, the yardage is there. And over the last couple of years, those touchdowns have sneakily been there, despite the fact that a lot of people don't look at him as a red zone threat. Either way, the fact that he plays against the AFC East, it has been one of the tougher divisions over the last couple of years. He's lined up against J.C. Jackson, Stephon Gilmore, Xavier Howard, Byron Jones, and with all of that, he's still averaged 16.87 fantasy points per game against the AFC East. A lot of potential here for Stefon Diggs in 2022. Moving on, let's talk about Davante Adams. Now, I've most recently moved Davante Adams up on my list because, some of these other wide receivers don't seem as promising as one of the best wide receivers in the league, if not the best at this current moment in time. And yes, he's going to be moving from the Green Bay Packers to the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, I don't personally see the decline in terms of his overall fantasy point production being that massive, but it's going to be sizable considering the amount of opportunities he saw in the Green Bay Packers offense. Again, in the last 2 years with Aaron Rodgers under center, Davante Adams was averaging 10.85 targets per game and 20.85 fantasy points per game. That's a 27-game span in which he was unbelievable for us in fantasy football. He has scored 10-plus touchdowns in 5 out of the last 6 seasons. The only season in which he wasn't able to do so was 2019, had a turf toe injury, missed 4 games throughout that year, which was the main culprit as to why he wasn't able to accomplish that. But going into the 2022 season, you now move him to the Las Vegas Raiders offense. What can we potentially anticipate? I'm thinking there's going to be a lot of success because this is a quarterback wide receiver tandem that already built their chemistry back in 2012, 2013 at Fresno State. Again, the final season that they played together at college, 131 receptions, 1,700 receiving yards, and 24 receiving touchdowns for Adams. Now, obviously the question is going to kind of revolve around how is this offense going to function? They already have Hunter Renfrow, who had 100-plus targets last season. They had Darren Waller that in 2020 had 145 total targets. Yes, we have seen wide receiver receiving options in general have a lot of targets in this offense with Derek Carr. You even go back to 2015. We saw Michael Crabtree garner 145 targets. So I easily think that Davante Adams is going to step up and be that number one option. He's going to get over 150 targets. And yes, it's going to be a little bit less than he saw in seasons past, but I still think he's an incredible talent, and that rapport that he immediately is going to find with Derek Carr just automatically means that he's going to find fantasy success in 2022. All right, moving on to CeeDee Lamb. Now, when I was talking about moving Davante Adams up, it was specifically in regards to moving him ahead of CeeDee Lamb. Here's the thing. If, in fact, you're ranking CeeDee Lamb as the number 6 overall wide receiver in fantasy, which at this point I currently have him at, he's got to be number 6 or better. And I don't know if he's in that conversation at a defined point. Sure, he's going to be the de facto number 1 wide receiver of this offense. You no longer have Amari Cooper. You no longer have Cedric Wilson. That's 164 potential targets vacated, open for his potential to increase his overall production. You don't have Michael Gallup for the first couple games of the season. He, avoided the PUP list, which means he's not going to be out for the first 6 weeks. He should be back soon. But overall, from what we've seen from CeeDee Lamb with Dak Prescott over the first 2 seasons of his career has only been 7.6 targets per game on average and 12.5 fantasy points per game in the 21 games that they've played together. That, in my opinion, is not going to cut it. Those numbers have to increase by tenfold. Now, when I went ahead and looked at the 2021 year and the amount of games in which CeeDee Lamb was given 6 or more targets, there were 10 contests in which he was given as such. In those games, he was averaging 15.96 fantasy points per game, and 8 of those 10 contests were 10 or more fantasy points. So at a bare minimum, every single game, he should be seeing 6 or more targets. It shouldn't be 10 out of his 17 games. It needs to be 17 out of 17. 6 targets per game for a full season is not a lot. So unless this man is getting funnel targeted the whole year, which 100% needs to be a part of this game plan, I'll begin to worry if we don't see those numbers continue to rack up, especially considering there aren't many other receiving options in this offense. You have, of course, Tyron Smith going down, probably out for the whole season. They're going to have to get the ball out of Dak's hands quickly, put CeeDee Lamb in the slot, and let him just tear apart defenses. That's the hope. And we'll see if the Cowboys disappoint us this year, but I'm thinking CeeDee Lamb should be able to get the job done at this capacity. He's just got to see a lot more targets go in his direction. More opportunity will lead to success. Moving on, let's talk about Mike Evans. Again, Mike Evans is another one of these extremely consistent wide receivers that sits in the C tier because you know what you're going to get from him every single year. He's had 8 consecutive seasons of over 1,000 receiving yards. That's going back to 2014 when he was drafted. Now, in the last 2 years with Tom Brady, he has had a resurgence in terms of statistics. Again, he's been averaging 14.37 fantasy points per game, all while Tom Brady last season was posting career highs in passing attempts, passing completions, passing yardage, had the second most passing touchdowns in his own career. I mean, Tom Brady has evolved as a player, and he's, of course, helping Mike Evans find a lot of fantasy success in that regard. Now, going into 2022, one of the key factors of Mike Evans continuing to find success is touchdowns. Now, in the last 30 games that Mike Evans and Tom Brady have played together, in which Mike Evans hasn't left the game due to injury or anything of that regard, Evans has scored 27 touchdowns. Again, that's 27 of the last 30 games they have played together. Now, obviously, a lot of that success is found down on the goal line, in which he's been able to score 17 receiving touchdowns from inside the 10-yard line. As long as that combination continues to be as such, regardless of the fact that they're bringing in a Kyle Rudolph, Julio Jones, Russell Gage, these things don't concern me. We know Mike Evans is the number 1 on this offense, and as long as Godwin is going to miss some time early in the year, Evans is going to be called upon to carry the team on his back in terms of the receiving game. Moving on, we have Deebo Samuel, the final player of the C tier. Now, I'm sure we can all unanimously say that he had an incredible year. It was out of nowhere. We were all on the Brandon Aiyuk hype train this time last season. But hey, Deebo Samuel put away all those injuries of the past and had an incredible 2021 year. Now, obviously, a lot of that had to do with the rushing touchdowns. He had 8 of them last year, over 400 rushing yards, and those contributions certainly elevated his game. But we have to keep in mind, even if we eliminated all those rushing statistics and just isolate him as a normal wide receiver going into the 2022 season, last year, with only receiving stats, he would have had 215 fantasy points, which would have made him last year the number 9 overall wide receiver. Again, I have him as my number 8 on today's tier list. So overall, I'm thinking to myself, Deebo Samuel should be in line to have a great season. On top of the fact, from weeks 1 through 9 of the 2021 year, prior to Deebo really transforming into the running back that he was averaging 10.13 targets per game and 17.61 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. That's an 8-game stretch. I mean, those are even better numbers than we could have anticipated. And if those continue to go in the right direction, Deebo should continue to be in this conversation of a top-tier wide receiver. Now, with Trey Lance last season, they played 2.5 games together. The second half of the Seattle game, the full Houston game, and the full Arizona game. In those contests, Deebo Samuel collected 10 receptions, 228 total receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, and 45.8 fantasy points. And that's in 2.5 games. There's a lot of potential for upside in 2021, regardless of the quarterback, who I think Trey Lance only elevates his potential. All right, let's begin the D tier, beginning with one of my favorite players going into the 2022 season, Michael Pittman Jr. I think he's going to elevate his game to the next level, mainly because of what we're going to see in terms of the offensive line protecting the quarterback and Matt Ryan finally having a functioning offense surrounding him for the first time in a couple years now. Now, many of you look at Matt Ryan and think he's washed. Again, in an Atlanta offense, anybody's going to look washed. They don't have the pieces to protect, and they really didn't have anybody to catch the ball last season besides Kyle Pitts. Again, there was no Calvin Ridley, and Cordero Patterson was the next best receiving option. That kind of puts into perspective what kind of situation that was. But one of the most interesting stats I found this offseason regarding Matt Ryan was that since 2008, his number 1 targeted receiving option per year on average has been targeted 155 times. That led to 96 receptions, over 1,300 receiving yards, and 7 receiving touchdowns. That went from Roddy White to Harry Douglas, Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley to Kyle Pitts. Again, that's from 2008 to 2021. A lot of success has been seen. Now, Michael Pittman last year, despite the fact that he had Carson Wentz, was still the number 15 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. But now that you go ahead and increase the quality of his targets and the quantity, I mean, his target share increases, the opportunity increases, the potential for them getting down into the goal line more often will continue to go up, and Michael Pittman's fantasy points will do as such. Moving on, we have Mike Williams as our next wide receiver. Again, I might be the only one that thinks Mike Williams is still a top 12 wide receiver. I mean, obviously he posted those numbers last season, but you have to remember last year he had career highs in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and was 1 receiving touchdown away from meeting his overall career high of 10. Now, obviously, there were many of opportunities down in the red zone in which he wasn't able to complete and get a touchdown. The amount of times I saw on film this offseason that he was tackled on the 3, on the 1, on the 5-yard line, ready to go in and score. It happens to every player, but for Mike Williams, far more often than it should have. Now, last season, many of you were going to point to the fact that, weeks 1 through 5, he was, the number 1 overall wide receiver in fantasy, averaging over 20 fantasy points per game and just dominating, over 10 targets per game, scoring touchdowns left, right, and center. And then after that, weeks 6 through 18, he completely fell off, started averaging 9.82 fantasy points per game, pretty much half of his production gone. And he was the number 29 wide receiver throughout that span of time. But we have to remember a couple things. First and foremost, dealt with a knee injury. If you guys remember, prior to that Baltimore Ravens game, he did not practice a single time throughout that entire week. He went into that game, they got blown out. They held him out for the entirety of the second half because, again, his knee was still busted. He went on a bye week, and even from then on, wasn't the same wide receiver. The health concerns and the health issues really bothered him until late in the season, where he was able to get back on the horse and get back to being a dominant wide receiver 1 candidate. You have to remember that with Justin Herbert under center, this offense is going to continue to be at the top 5 of the league. They're going to continue to pass the ball more than just about anybody, target their wide receivers just about as much as anybody else in the league. And when I went ahead and took a deeper dive between the Herbert and Mike Williams connection, in the 15 games in which Herbert targeted Mike Williams 7 or more times in the last 2 years, Mike Williams has averaged 16.69 fantasy points per game. And in 11 of those 15 games, he put up 10 or more fantasy points. That's 73% of the time. Getting 7 targets per game for 16 games is not difficult. They got to continue to funnel target their primary receivers. I think they'll absolutely do so this year. There's a reason why they paid Mike Williams all that money. Moving on, we have Tyreek Hill. Again, Tyreek Hill is, we know how good he is, guys. This has been a top 5 wide receiver for a very long time with Patrick Mahomes, but now you don't have Patrick Mahomes. So let's address that first and foremost. If you go back to the 2017 year with Alex Smith under center, this was still a great wide receiver. He put up 209 fantasy points, was the number 4 overall wide receiver in that given season. And yes, there was less overall production, but we do have a baseline as to where he can end up. 205 to 210 fantasy points kind of leaves him at the back end of the wide receiver 1 conversation. And even when we look at games in which it wasn't with Alex Smith, it was with Matt Moore. Back in 2019, with Patrick Mahomes went down with that knee injury where he dislocated it Thursday night against the Denver Broncos. In the 3 games that Tyreek Hill played with Matt Moore, he was averaging 16.5 fantasy points per game. Now you change up the equation a little bit. You put Tyreek Hill in a Dolphins offense ran by Mike McDaniel, not Andy Reid, and you don't have Patrick Mahomes. And we get into a conversation as to whether or not Tua is good enough to allow Tyreek Hill to be a wide receiver 1. Again, if you look at Tua's first 16 starts of his NFL career, even though they weren't done consecutively because of injuries and because of Ryan Fitzpatrick, kind of going back and forth with him his rookie year, in the first 16 starts of Tua's career where he never left the game early due to a health concern, he had a 68% passing completion percentage, had 3,800 passing yards, 24 passing touchdowns, 14 interceptions. Yes, he turned over the ball, but he was able to get the ball down the field at an efficient rate and accurately. I think there's a very good argument for Tua this upcoming season to be able to at least support Tyreek Hill into a wide receiver 1 conversation. Again, do not forget, Tua last season in terms of adjusted completion percentage was the number 1 quarterback overall in terms of passes 20 or more yards down the field. That is an incredible statistic that you have to take into account because Tyreek Hill is a deep ball receiver. And this offense is obviously going to want to use his speed to take the top off of opposing defenses and make defensive coordinators nervous all week long until game day. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about T. Higgins, the number 2 wide receiver of the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, this is the way I see it. Having 2 wide receivers in the top 12 is a very difficult task to accomplish. But if anybody's going to do it, it's going to be Joe Burrow. Because again, last season, we saw in multiple occasions both these guys be top 12 wide receivers at the same time. From weeks 8 through 17, when T. Higgins returned from his injury, he was averaging 14.67 fantasy points per game and was the number 7 overall fantasy throughout that span of time. On top of it, Jamar Chase, throughout that span of time, was the number 8 overall wide receiver in fantasy football in terms of total points scored. So they've gone ahead and found a great connection. Obviously, T. Higgins, especially going into the playoffs, had himself a great run. In 7 of his last 10 games, he totaled 95 or more receiving yards. Last season, if he didn't get injured early on, he was on pace to being the number 9 overall wide receiver in fantasy football, putting up over 220 fantasy points. Now, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of potential for Joe Burrow to support 2 wide receivers in the top 12. When I've gone ahead and looked at quarterbacks of the past in the last 5-6 years that have supported 2 top 12 wide receivers, the minimum production has been 4,200 passing yards and 30 passing touchdowns. Again, those aren't unbelievable record-breaking numbers. Last season, Joe Burrow already accomplished that. So going into the 2022 year, T. Higgins is in a great opportunity to be a top 12 wide receiver, so draft him as such. Moving on, let's talk about A.J. Brown. Obviously, this is another one of these wide receivers that is moving homes. Now, with the Tennessee Titans, since 2019, with Ryan Tannehill under center, he was averaging 14.26 fantasy points per game. That's 23 touchdowns in those 35 games. Now, obviously, touchdowns have been a big difference maker in terms of his overall production in comparison to other receiving options, but that's just how the offense was built. Down in the red zone, when you get down there with Derrick Henry, a lot of teams are stacking the box, giving, A.J. Brown a lot of opportunities to score touchdowns. Now, you join an Eagles offense, a team that threw the ball the fewest times amongst all teams in the National Football League last year, only 494 total passing attempts. But you have a combination with Jalen Hurts, who is his best friend. And you talk about the conversation of A.J. Brown having the easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position and Jalen Hurts having the 4th easiest schedule at the quarterback position. In terms of fantasy point potential upside, I think a lot of people are sleeping on the idea that A.J. Brown just a couple years ago was a wide receiver 1 in a very similar run-first offense. You go ahead and you change the quarterback position a little bit, that's fine. As long as there's rapport there and they've built that this offseason, I think A.J. Brown has a lot of potential to prove a lot of people wrong this year. Let's talk about Keenan Allen. Now, Keenan Allen gets himself into this conversation purely off of consistency. Over the last 5 years, since 2017, he has been the number 14 wide receiver or better in a half PPR scoring format. In a full PPR, he's been a top 12 wide receiver for 5 consecutive years. But in the last 5 years, he has put up a minimum of 97 receptions, over 900 receiving yards, and 6 receiving touchdowns every year. This is absolute consistency. And what we've seen him do with Justin Herbert in an elevated offense, averaging 10.78 targets per game, 14.16 fantasy points per game in the 27 games that they've played together. When you're talking about the number one wide receiver option of a top 5 NFL offense, of course, success is guaranteed. But you also mentioned the idea that, Keenan Allen in the last 5 years has had the most receptions amongst all receivers in the National Football League, 3 more than Davante Adams, and he's had the 5th most fantasy points amongst all wide receivers in a half PPR scoring format, only behind Adams, Hopkins, Diggs, and Tyreek Hill. This is elite level production in an offense that is going to continue to funnel target him the ball. 2022 seems like a pretty good year for Keenan Allen. All right, let's talk about Courtland Sutton. Listen, Courtland Sutton is one of those wide receivers that can make a giant jump from being a wide receiver that many of us have forgotten about to being a guy that absolutely can be a top 15 candidate. And I'll tell you why. Since 2015, Russell Wilson has been able to support at least one top 15 fantasy wide receiver every single year, whether that was Doug Baldwin into Tyler Lockett, and then most recently, of course, DK Metcalf being a top 12 wide receiver each of the last 2 seasons. And we compare a lot of what Courtland Sutton can potentially do with DK Metcalf. Because again, when you go back to 2019, Courtland Sutton, prior to his ACL injury, was a top 19 fantasy wide receiver, despite playing with guys like Drew Lock. Again, there is a lot of potential for success for this young wide receiver. And when you have massive overhauls in terms of changes at the quarterback position, you're bringing in a West Coast passing offense with Nathaniel Hackett, the former offensive coordinator of the Green Bay Packers. This offense is going to continue to take steps forward. And obviously, it's going to begin with Russell Wilson helping him elevate his game. Since 2019, Russell Wilson has been the number 1 overall quarterback in terms of deep passes, 20 or more yards down the field. He has been number 2 in total passing yards down the field in that regard and touchdowns. DK Metcalf over the last 3 years has accumulated 30 catches, 1,130 receiving yards, and 11 receiving touchdowns in terms of targets, 20 or more yards down the field. When you think of Courtland Sutton, you think of a bigger statured wide receiver that can make plays down the field. And that's exactly what he's going to do in 2022 for the Denver Broncos. All right, let's go ahead and move on and begin our E tier with Allen Robinson, wide receiver, newly of the Los Angeles Rams. Now, there's a lot of excitement coming from me, maybe not from others, in regards to the potential of what Allen Robinson can accomplish. Again, we have to remember that he has posted wide receiver 1 numbers back in the day, was it 2015 with Blake Bortles with the Jacksonville Jaguars, okay? He was a wide receiver 1 back then. Then most recently in 2019 and in 2020, he was a number 1 wide receiver with Mitchell Trubisky and Nick Foles. So overall, we've seen a lot of production and a lot of consistency with Allen Robinson. Now, unfortunately, last year, he hurt many of us. And though you may have been hurt in the past by his overall lack of production, you have to remember that the Chicago Bears as a whole last season, whether it was Andy Dalton or Justin Fields, were just awful. There's a reason why. They changed the head coach and they changed a lot of that organization, even going to the top, to the general manager. Top to bottom, that was just not a succeeding program, and it's still not going to be in 2022. But you have to understand that Allen Robinson's lack of production last season wasn't only just because of the injury he sustained, on top of the virus protocol and the fact that Justin Fields was awful in the games that they played together. They played 9 games together, and Justin Fields had more interceptions than touchdowns, almost by 2-fold. Again, those numbers are not going to help a wide receiver like Allen Robinson succeed because he needs those high target numbers, and he wasn't able to get it. Now, he joins an offense in which he's going to have the best quarterback he's ever played with. An offense that has thrown the ball to their wide receiver position the most amongst all teams in 2021. And even though there is Cooper Kupp getting a lot of targets, even if you gave him his 191 targets once again this upcoming season, there is still 260 potential available targets to grab. If we end up seeing Allen Robinson accumulate 120, 130 targets, he is going to be in this top 16 conversation, which is why I have him here. Again, we have to remember, prior to Robert Woods going down with his ACL injury, weeks 1 through 9, he was the number 11 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. Then they bring in OBJ. Odell Beckham between weeks 13 through 18 was the number 13 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. If you combined their season stats when they both played for the Rams, that would have accumulated 188.7 fantasy points. That would have made them the number 20 overall wide receiver. I think those numbers are relatively low from what the potential of Allen Robinson is this upcoming season. That's why I have him at the beginning of the E tier. Moving on, we have DJ Moore, another one of these consistent wide receivers, but can he take the consistency he has proven over the last 3 years and elevate that to the next level? That's the hope. I mean, purely the fact that this man has played with 8 different quarterbacks already in his career since 2018, it's just sad. Now you get the 9th, I think, with Baker Mayfield. I mean, goodness gracious. Yes, Baker is a huge upgrade, but the fact that DJ Moore has only been able to be the number 18, the number 22, and the number 19 overall wide receiver in each of the last 3 seasons, has been able to put up over 1,150 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns each of the last 3 years, but hasn't been able to get over the hump. He hasn't been able to get over 4 touchdowns or into that next level capacity. Now, last year he had 163 targets, and hopefully those numbers are going to continue. You bring in Ben McAdoo. He's going to be the offense coordinator of this team. He was the former head coach of the Giants from 2014 through 2017. If you guys remember, that's when OBJ was taking over. In those games, they were throwing the ball 38 times per game, and OBJ was getting 10.6 targets per game and averaging 17.6 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. So why not DJ Moore, kind of be incorporated into that similar manner and continue to get him the ball 10 times plus per game with Baker Mayfield? I think a lot of success can be found. Now, for those of you who are believers in DJ Moore and do not believe that Christian McCaffrey can stay healthy, here's some good information. In the games in which DJ Moore has played without Christian McCaffrey, in the last 2 seasons, he has averaged an additional 1.72 half PPR fantasy points per game. That would mean an additional 27.52 total fantasy points. You can add on to his numbers if you assume Christian McCaffrey's not going to be playing this year, which will only help DJ Moore. Moving on, let's talk about Diontae Johnson. Listen, you guys remember I was banging the table for Diontae Johnson last year. One of my favorite wide receivers because the targets and the ability that he has shown and proven is undeniable. I mean, just reading these stats alone, it's just insane that a wide receiver could do this. In the 27 games that he played with Big Ben Roethlisberger, he was averaging 11 targets per game and 14.25 fantasy points per game. That's 10 plus targets in 21 out of those 26 contests. That's 80% of the time he was getting double-digit targets. He is the only player as of the last 2 seasons to have back-to-back years of 10 games of 10 or more targets. And we're talking about Keenan Allen, Davante Adams, Stefon Diggs, who weren't able to accomplish that in each of the last 2 seasons, but Diontae Johnson was able to. And the reason why? Because he continues to find himself open. If they put him in man coverage, he is going to dice up that defense. He finds himself open so often, quarterbacks just have to throw him the ball. Specifically, Ben Roethlisberger, who didn't really have a shoulder, couldn't throw the ball that far down the field. He felt a comfort with throwing the ball towards Diontae Johnson, and I'm sure whether it is Mitchell Trubisky, Mason Rudolph, or Kenny Pickett, the same idea is going to stand true in 2022. Now, we have to remember there's going to be a little bit of a downside in terms of overall opportunity. Big Ben Roethlisberger was really just throwing it only to him at times. And we have to remember, in 2020, they targeted their wide receivers the most times. And in 2021, they targeted their wide receivers the 3rd most times amongst all teams in the National Football League. Obviously, Mitch Trubisky, he's been known to be able to target a primary wide receiver. Allen Robinson from 2019 through 2020 targeted him 9.5 times per game. I think there's a lot of potential for Diontae Johnson to once again be a wide receiver 2 option. Moving on, let's talk about Marquise Brown. Now, this is another wide receiver that has made the move this offseason. You move him from a Baltimore Ravens run-first offense, a team that has targeted their wide receivers the least amount of times since 2019, since Marquise Brown has arrived on the scene, yet he's still been able to find a lot of success. Last year was a culmination of that chemistry with Lamar Jackson. From weeks 1 through 13, he was averaging 13.77 fantasy points per game and was the number 17 overall wide receiver. Now you go ahead and add him to the Arizona Cardinals offense because he knows that Baltimore Ravens offense just wasn't accentuating his talents. It wasn't allowing him to get to his next level and secure more money in those contracts. But you bring in the Oklahoma connection, the rapport of a college quarterback and his college wide receiver Kyler and Marquise Brown. You bring in the idea of Cliff Kingsbury and his offensive schemes, throwing the ball as much as he possibly can every single week. The DeAndre Hopkins suspension from weeks 1 through 6, only adding more opportunity for Marquise Brown to step up and become a primary option in this offensive passing scheme. And let's not forget Kyler Murray in 2021 in terms of passing completion percentage in passes 20 or more yards down the field was number 1, 49.29%. He was number 2 in passing yards, 20 or more yards down the field, and number 3 in passing touchdowns. Again, when you're talking about a speedster wide receiver that is going to play on the outside, along with his former college quarterback, the rapport there in an offense that wants to throw the ball, the sky's the limit for Marquise Brown. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about Brandin Cooks. Another one of these wide receivers that I find a lot of comfort in drafting because of his overall success and consistency. Since 2015, Brandin Cooks has had 1,000 or more receiving yards in 6 out of the last 7 seasons. The only season he wasn't able to do so was 2019 due to the injuries. Now, he's also been able to maintain a top 20 fantasy standing in 6 out of the last 7 seasons. Again, those numbers, he's been the number 14, 9, 12, 13, 15, and 20 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. Now you go ahead and you have another season with the Houston Texans, and though the quarterback position is going to be Davis Mills, and though many of you may think that Davis Mills can't help him maintain his wide receivers 2 standing, I think you're just purely mistaken. In weeks 8 through 18, when Davis Mills was the starting quarterback and Brandin Cooks didn't leave the game early with an injury, Brandin Cooks was averaging 9.8 targets per game and 17.88 fantasy points per game. Those are unbelievable statistics, and I think they're only going to continue to build upon it. With the negative game scripts that the Houston Texans will likely see this year, Davis Mills is definitely going to get Brandin Cooks the ball. Let's move on to DK Metcalf, the Terminator in my book. Again, DK Metcalf, the whole question is who's playing quarterback. Purely, that is the entire question, because now that you have no Russell Wilson, what can we expect from him? Last year, he played 13 quarters with Geno Smith. Now, if we go ahead and isolate the statistics they've gained together last season, DK Metcalf would average 17.72 half PPR fantasy points per game. A lot of production, even with Geno Smith. A lot of touchdown upside as well. Now, let's say, for example, they transition to Drew Lock because they believe that is going to be their future at the quarterback position. When you look at Drew Lock's first 17 starts in the National Football League, where he didn't leave the game early with an injury, this man has totaled 4,100 passing yards and 24 passing touchdowns. Serviceable numbers for a quarterback that just needs to help his number 1 wide receiver option. But this is not the only quarterback that may be in the mix, and I'll tell you exactly why. There's a lot of rumors, there's a lot of birds chirping regarding Jimmy Garoppolo becoming the next quarterback of the Seattle Seahawks. Now, according to Michael Lombardi, a former GM in the National Football League, he's heard some whispers in regards to why the 49ers haven't traded away Jimmy Garoppolo. It's because a lot of teams don't want to pay his overall contract if they're trading for him, and they'd rather see the 49ers cut him, and the number 1 suited option, the team that is most excited about picking up Jimmy Garoppolo's services, according to Michael Lombardi, would be the Seattle Seahawks. Now, the reason why they haven't already cut him is because they play against Seattle in week 2, and they don't want to give any ammunition to Jimmy G to have a revenge game in that contest. They want to avoid him at all costs so that they can go ahead and keep Trey Lance confident and the team and the fan base confident that they're making the right decision. Nonetheless, don't forget weeks 1 through 9, when Deebo Samuel was on a wide receiver tear, he was still averaging 10 targets per game and 17 fantasy points per game. A lot of that production done with Jimmy G. If he ends up being the quarterback here, DK Metcalf easily a top 24 wide receiver. All right, let's move on to Terry McLaurin, the last wide receiver I wanted to mention here in the E tier. Terry McLaurin has had a bunch of unfortunate situations in his career. Thus far, he has had 8 different starting quarterbacks. Carson Wentz will be the 9th of his career. I mean, there are identical parallels from what DJ Moore and Terry McLaurin have been able to do each of the last couple years. But unfortunately, neither of them have been able to take the next step. I mean, you look at what Terry McLaurin had to deal with last year. Only 62.6% of Terry McLaurin's targets were deemed catchable. That's the lowest rate amongst all wide receivers in the National Football League last year, with 100 or more targets. Now that you go ahead and make a pretty big upgrade at quarterback, going from Taylor Heineke to Carson Wentz, who has been, we've seen Carson Wentz be an MVP candidate in this league, and he can certainly get back there. It's just a matter of the right position. I think he could certainly help elevate Terry McLaurin's potential. Again, let's not forget, Michael Pittman Jr. was the number 15 overall wide receiver last year with the services of a Carson Wentz. Now, in Terry McLaurin's career, when he's been given ample opportunity, in terms of catching the ball 5 or more times in a game throughout his career, he's been able to get 23 games in which he's been able to accomplish that. In 19 of those games, he's been able to surpass 10 or more fantasy points. He's averaged 15.8 fantasy points anytime he has 5 or more catches. It will not be difficult to get him into that conversation, considering, again, Pittman last year for the Colts had 11 games of 5 or more catches. You get Terry McLaurin into that conversation, he should be a top 24 receiver. Let's move on to the beginning of the F tier. And though you may think, Andrew, why is Jaylen Waddle in the F tier? Listen, even though it's an F, and many of you, think of Fs as bad grades, in terms of a tier list, we're building an entire argument with only 40 wide receivers. I mean, again, we're splitting hairs here. And the F tier really isn't that bad. These are still top 25 receiving options going into the 2022 year. So don't let the color or let the letter, confuse you. So let's talk about Jaylen Waddle. Last season, when Tua was the starting quarterback and was healthy, he was averaging 14.67 fantasy points per game throughout those 10 games. Also, the crazy stat was that every single game that Tua was the starter with Jaylen Waddle had 6 targets minimum. Those kind of numbers obviously led to the success that Jaylen Waddle was able to find. The most receptions by a rookie in NFL history, breaking Anquan Boldin's former record. Of course, now you go ahead and add him into an offense that is going to have some improvements. Tyreek Hill can pull away some distractions. You're going to have more of a semblance of a running game, which will, alleviate some of the pressure of being able to force Tua to throw the ball every single down. But hey, we don't mind that, because if you are able to get Jaylen Waddle the ball in space, he is a yak machine. Last season, he was number 9 amongst all receiving options with 455 yards after catch. And if you know the wide receiver options for the 49ers, whether it was Kittle or Deebo Samuel, they want to continue to allow their receivers to be in that yak conversation. Mike McDaniel's only going to help Jaylen Waddle accomplish that. Now, being able to support 2 top 24 wide receivers is difficult. But in the case of Tua, I think he's going to very easily be able to accomplish this. Again, when I've looked at the course of the history of the last 5-6 years of quarterbacks who've been able to support 2 top 24 wide receivers, all you really need is a minimum of like 38 to 4,000 passing yards, getting into that 28 to 32 passing touchdown range. If you're in that conversation, which hopefully Tua will be able to do so, considering he has shown in the first 16 starts of his career, he can definitely accomplish that. He obviously needs to step his game up a bit, but I think Jaylen Waddle certainly, it's going to be a great option. Probably less targets this year than last season. 141 is a crazy number. Over 100 catches his rookie year is ridiculous, but hey, maybe he ends up fooling us all and being the number 1 wide receiver of this offense once again while Tyreek Hill takes the backseat. You never know. Moving on, JuJu Smith-Schuster. Now, speaking of a top-tier offense and someone that's pretty much filling into Tyreek Hill's role, let's talk about JuJu and his potential. In 2018, with Big Ben Roethlisberger, JuJu Smith-Schuster was the number 9 overall wide receiver in fantasy with 241 fantasy points. In 2020, he was the number 18 overall wide receiver. With Big Ben, he's averaged 13.34 fantasy points per game throughout those 2 years, 2018 and 2020. Now, in terms of being a stud slot receiving option, JuJu has done it all. You go back to 2018 and 2020, the total opportunity and receiving work he accumulated from the slot is crazy. 195 targets, 143 receptions, 1,549 receiving yards, and 13 receiving touchdowns throughout those 2 years. Now look at what Tyreek Hill has done in the last 2 years from the slot position. 149 targets, 106 receptions, 1,250 receiving yards, and 13 receiving touchdowns. I see some parallels here. I see a lot of opportunity opening up in the idea that JuJu can fill in to that Tyreek Hill slot role and be a dominant force. Now, many of you look at Patrick Mahomes' season last year and think, man, Patrick Mahomes did not play well. That was his off year. If his off year is 4,800 passing yards and 37 passing touchdowns, imagine if he's going to continue to elevate that and what wide receivers like JuJu Smith-Schuster are going to be able to accomplish in this offense. Moving on, we have Jerry Jeudy of the Denver Broncos. Now, like I've mentioned a little bit earlier, Courtland Sutton is going to pretty much be the DK Metcalf of that offense, which would then make Jerry Jeudy the Tyler Lockett. Again, Tyler Lockett has been a top 15 wide receiver, each of the last 4 seasons. So with the influence of a Russell Wilson and Nathaniel Hackett, the new head coach of this team, bringing in a West Coast pass-heavy offense, on top of the fact that Tim Patrick, unfortunately, season-ending ACL injury only guarantees more opportunity for Jerry Jeudy in this offense. We're expecting this offense to be good, but how good can Jerry Jeudy be? Has what we've seen in the last couple of years, really been a product of the fact that Teddy Bridgewater and Drew Lock have been the starting quarterbacks? If that's going to be the case, then Jerry Jeudy is far too low on my list. But at this current moment in time, I don't know what Jerry Jeudy I'm getting. I don't know if he's going to be able to be a deep threat like Tyler Lockett was. Let's not forget Tyler Lockett. In the last 3 years, 38 catches of 20 or more yards, over 1,100 receiving yards in that matter, and 11 receiving touchdowns, mainly because Russell Wilson has been the number 1 deep passing quarterback in the last 3 seasons. Obviously, Russell Wilson's a quarterback that, prior to last season had 4 or 5 consecutive years of 31 or more total passing touchdowns, has been a QB1 in every single one of his seasons in fantasy prior to 2021, of course, the mallet finger. Ultimately, there's a lot of potential here. It's just a matter of whether or not Jerry Jeudy can act upon it. Moving on, we have Gabriel Davis, one of the most Interesting wide receivers. Now, many of you will remember Gabriel Davis from the performance of a lifetime in the divisional round against the Kansas City Chiefs. 10 targets, 8 catches, 201 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns. But I remember him from his rookie year in 2020 from weeks 12 through 17, in which he was playing 88.5% of the offensive snaps, averaging over 10.73 fantasy points per game. And a lot of that was due to the fact that John Brown went down with an injury. And then we go into his sophomore year, 2021. They bring in Emmanuel Sanders, and he takes a little bit of a back seat. But hey, from weeks 14 through 18, when Emmanuel Sanders got injured and was out of the lineup. But here comes Gabriel Davis again, playing 88% of the snap count, averaging 11.68 fantasy points per game. And now you go into 2022, and there is no longer Cole Beasley and Emmanuel Sanders in this lineup. A vacated total of 184 targets. Yeah, there are other options in this offense, but when we're talking about one of the best offenses in the National Football League, a top 5 at that position in terms of being able to throw the ball down the field and find a lot of success, especially considering the fact that Josh Allen, back-to-back years of over 36 passing touchdowns. Gabriel Davis has already shown that he is going to be a massive red zone threat as long as he continues to stretch the field and gets ample opportunity. Now that he is a primary starting wide receiver, I absolutely expect him to be a top 30 wide receiver in 2022. Moving on, let's talk about Rashod Bateman. He's going to be the number 1 option for the Baltimore Ravens offense. And in seasons past, that hasn't been the most valuable thing, but last year it certainly was. Hollywood Brown, weeks 1 through 13, along with Sammy Watkins, if you combine their overall contribution when Lamar Jackson was healthy last year, that's 145 targets, 92 receptions, 1,200 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, and 208 fantasy points and a half PPR. There's a lot of potential for opportunity, especially considering the fact that, yes, Mark Andrews is going to get his work. Isaiah Likely, Devin Duvernay, some of the running backs will catch a couple passes, but ultimately it is going to be Rashod Bateman as the number 1 receiving option. He's a former first-round selection as a wide receiver, combine speed of 4.48. We're talking about elite level talent here. And if you're able to just give him the opportunity, he's going to be able to excel. Now, obviously, this is going to be an offense that doesn't want to throw the ball much. They want to continue to pound the rock on the ground and use Lamar Jackson's assets as a runner, to continue to force teams to stack the box so that when they use play action, Rashod Bateman is going to be open. But Rashod Bateman's got to have to be a touchdown machine. In the first 3 years of Hollywood Brown's career, he scored 21 touchdowns with Lamar Jackson. If he's not able to at least copy similar numbers to Hollywood Brown, Rashod Bateman's going to have a little bit of trouble because, again, the receiving work in terms of targets may not be at a high capacity like it was for Marquise Hollywood Brown last season, considering Lamar Jackson had to throw as much as he possibly could because their running game was Latavius Murray and Devonta Freeman. Now that you get J.K. Dobbins back, I think this running game is going to be a lot more consistent. But either way, Rashod Bateman, the opportunity is yours. You just got to run away with it. Let's move on to Darnell Mooney, the number 1 wide receiver of the Chicago Bears. Listen, the Chicago Bears are an interesting team. They should probably be in negative game scripts all year long. Last year, Darnell Mooney was the number 1. He supplanted Allen Robinson, had 140 total targets and a 26.41% target share. Again, that's 140 targets of the total 530 passing attempts the team had last season. Now, obviously, when we talk about the potential of this offense going forward, we have 192 total vacated targets that led to 166 receptions, 1,400 receiving yards, 9 receiving touchdowns. A lot of wide receivers are no longer here. Allen Robinson, Jimmy Graham, a lot of options are off the table. Now, they brought in a couple guys, Byron Pringle, Velus Jones, N'Keal Harry. They brought in a couple, sources that may catch the ball, Equanimeous St. Brown. I'm not too worried about that. Those all should be going in the direction of Darnell Mooney, and I'm expecting him to have very similar target numbers. Now, even though Justin Fields isn't the quarterback to throw the ball, to a singular wide receiver 130, 140 times, at least we'll be able to find some semblance of success when he's able to do so. Mooney with Fields last season only averaged 10 fantasy points per game, but when he was targeted 6 or more times, it was a 13.83 fantasy point per game average. So with that all said, even though the Chicago Bears offense is going to be horrible, I think Darnell Mooney should certainly find a lot of success with the ample opportunity he's given. All right, let's move on to the G tier. Let's begin with Adam Thielen. Again, Adam Thielen's a little bit of a gamble, mainly because of his injury history. And, even though this is the case, I really want to have Adam Thielen on my team. Besides like best ball leagues where you absolutely have to draft him, in regular leagues, I still want to grab him because of how much success he has found in his career. When Adam Thielen hasn't missed significant amounts of time in a season, he's always been a top 10 fantasy wide receiver. Going back to 2017, again, he was the number 10 wide receiver. The following year, 2018, number 7. 2019 dealt with an injury, was the number 61 overall wide receiver. In 2020, was the number 8 overall wide receiver. And last year, obviously, dealt with the ankle injury, was number 28. The reason why he's been able to accomplish such high levels of success, obviously, Kirk Cousins, that level of production is going to increase now that you bring in Kevin O'Connell and the Los Angeles Rams Sean McVay-esque offensive scheme, which is only going to elevate the receiving options of the team, but also the fact that Adam Thielen has scored 24 touchdowns in the last 26 games. With Justin Jefferson, he's still averaging 14.51 fantasy points per game. He was playing well with, Stefon Diggs on this team. He's going to continue to play well with JJ on this team. This offense is loaded. They're stacked. And as long as Adam Thielen can stay healthy, he should be a great wide receiver option in fantasy. Let's move on to Michael Thomas. Now, I was, banging the drum for Michael Thomas all offseason. Obviously, he had to go ahead and have a hamstring issue pop up, right before the season's about to start. Those are the injuries that really do tick me off, because those are the soft tissue injuries that really, they will bother a player to the point where, they're just never going to be the same. And hopefully it's not one of those, and hopefully they've addressed it and he's healing properly. But let's talk about what the potential is of a Michael Thomas this year. Even without Drew Brees in the lineup, we have to understand that Michael Thomas has found consistent success in the past, whether it has been with Taysom Hill. You go back to Teddy Bridgewater, 2018 through 2019. In the 7 games they played together, Michael Thomas was still getting over 10 targets per game and averaging over 16 fantasy points per game. Now, a lot of you look at Jameis Winston and think, hey, this is the guy that threw 30 interceptions in a singular year. We can't trust him. But again, from 2015 through 2019 with Mike Evans was averaging 9.5 targets per game and almost 14 fantasy points per game throughout 68 contests together. Now we're talking about a wide receiver that has been the king of the yak over his career. I mean, again, in 2019 was number 1 in yak. In 2018 was number 3. In 2017 was number 6. In 2016, he was number 6. Get the guy the ball in open space. He will make plays with his feet, and he will continue to elevate the value of the players around him. Hopefully, Michael Thomas is healthy and back, because the last time we saw him, he was the number 1 receiving option in the National Football League. Hopefully, he can get back, or at least somewhere close to that level of production. Moving on, we have Elijah Moore. Elijah Moore is a part of the Jets. We get it, but still, even a number 1 wide receiver for the Jets has value. Last year, from week 7 through 13, after the bye week, when Elijah Moore was given the opportunity to be the number 1 receiving option, he was averaging 15.16 fantasy points per game. That's a 7-game span. He was the number 4 overall wide receiver in fantasy points per game throughout that stretch of time, only behind Kupp, Jefferson, and Deebo. That just kind of puts into perspective the level of production he had, on top of the fact that he was getting over 8 targets per game on average and almost scoring a touchdown per game. Now, in 2022, the conversation is, can Zach Wilson help him elevate his game? Listen, I'm not convinced that Zach Wilson is going to be the player that elevates a wide receiver option of this caliber. Joe Flacco can certainly do so, because I trust Joe Flacco as a quarterback, but Zach Wilson's going to have to come a long way. That's why Elijah Moore's a little bit farther down here, because yes, he's going to get targets, but I don't know if he can elevate him to his overall potential this season as it stands. Hopefully, fingers crossed, they're able to do so. But now that you're bringing in other weapons like a Garrett Wilson, you still have Corey Davis there. You bring in brand new 2 tight ends. We have CJ Uzomah and we have Tyler Conklin. There's other options to throw the ball to, but hopefully Elijah Moore can stay a consistent part of the passing threat. Moving on, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown. Again, Amon-Ra St. Brown did legendary things last year. He obviously won me multiple fantasy football championships with his efforts between weeks 13 through 18, whether it was with Jared Goff or Tim Boyle, it did not matter. The guy was averaging 20.93 fantasy points per game. He had 6 consecutive games of 10 or more targets, 8 or more receptions, and 70 or more receiving yards. It's the first time a rookie's ever been able to accomplish that in the National Football League's history. But a lot of his success came from the fact that there weren't any other options to throw the ball to. Swift was gone. Hawkinson was gone. Again, the production that those two had in terms of overall targets from weeks 1 through 12 prior to them leaving with their injuries and not coming back, that accounted for about 13 targets per game that were up for grabs. Now, obviously, we all witnessed, the progression of Amon-Ra St. Brown last year as he early on was kind of dealing with the competition with Khalif Raymond, but eventually took over. I still think he's going to be a big part of this offense, but man, can we consistently rely upon 7-8 targets per game? That's to be seen. As of right now, I think there's a lot of mouths to feed in this offense, and they certainly want to start off by running the ball first and foremost and being a run-first team. Moving on, we have Amari Cooper as the next wide receiver of this G tier and the final wide receiver in that matter. Amari Cooper with Jacoby Brissett can very easily be a top 36 wide receiver. Jacoby Brissett was able to do this in the past with T.Y. Hilton when he was the starting quarterback of the Indianapolis Colts. So why not go ahead, invest in a wide receiver that is going to be, top 36 potential, hopefully for the first 11 weeks of the season. Then once Deshaun Watson returns, we are going to have an incredible elevation of play because, again, D-Hop with Deshaun Watson averaged 16.28 fantasy points per game together. Fuller averaged over 20 fantasy points per game with Watson. And even Brandin Cooks from weeks 5 through 17 of the 2020 season was averaging nearly 16 fantasy points per game. A lot of production here. And though I've heard a lot of rumors regarding Amari Cooper absolutely hating playing in the snow and cold weather games, and obviously seeing potential production dips in games which have been 50 degrees or lower, he's only averaging about 42 receiving yards. In games in which they're like 55 or above, over 62 receiving yards. There's a pretty big dip there. But hopefully the weather in Cleveland, especially when we get to November, December, January, isn't going to bother Amari Cooper that much. Hopefully he gets used to it by the time we get there. All right, moving on. We have Christian Kirk beginning the H tier. Christian Kirk, like I mentioned in the last couple of days, is going to fly up my rankings list, and he has done so. He's obviously got into the top 36 conversation, where he had a career high in receptions with 77 and receiving yards with 982. And I think both those numbers are very easily accomplishable this year with Doug Peterson, Trevor Lawrence, and the Jacksonville Jaguars offense. There's a reason why they reset the wide receiver market by making him one of the highest paid wide receivers in the National Football League. In Week 2's preseason game, we saw the first action of Christian Kirk this offseason in a live capacity. He played majority of the offensive snaps from the slot. He had 8 targets that led to 5 catches and 54 total receiving yards. I think this offense is going to continue to litter their slot position because from what we remember with Doug Peterson and the Philadelphia Eagles, he used 2 primary wide receivers. Alshon Jeffrey, which was the big-bodied outside wide receiver, which will probably end up being Marvin Jones in this offense. And he used Nelson Aguilar predominantly in the slot, who became a huge, kind of safety net blanket for the quarterbacks for the Eagles, whether it was Carson Wentz or Nick Foles in years past. I think Christian Kirk pretty much fills into that opportunity, and he's going to help elevate this offense and himself to the next level. Moving on, we have Allen Lazard. In my opinion, Allen Lazard should be the number 1 receiver for the Green Bay Packers. But the issue is I haven't heard a lot of hype regarding him. I haven't heard a lot out of training camp. Yes, I've heard, a couple statements out of Aaron Rodgers saying that he believes that Allen Lazard is in a position to step up and be the number 1 option for this offense. But again, I haven't, seen much else. It's been relatively quiet, and that scares me to an extent. But we got to remember, whoever ends up being the number 1 option of this offense is going to be insane. I mean, again, since 2008, the number 1 receiving option of an Aaron Rodgers-led offense has averaged 136 targets, 90 catches, 1,200 receiving yards, and 10 receiving touchdowns. That goes from Greg Jennings to Randall Cobb to Jordy Nelson to Davante Adams. In late last season, we saw an elevation of play from Allen Lazard, weeks 14 through 18, averaging 14.5 fantasy points per game, a touchdown a game, 4.2 catches per game, and only given 5.6 targets throughout that span of time. If you elevate those numbers from 5 targets per game to 9, imagine the levels of production we could see from Allen Lazard. Now, I know many of us are hoping that maybe one of these rookie wide receivers step up, but the history of rookie wide receivers with Aaron Rodgers has not been kind. Over the last couple of years, we have seen a lot of wide receivers, especially rookies, even going back to Davante Adams, Randall Cobb, Jordy Nelson, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Equanimeous St. Brown, and 10 other wide receivers that have been rookies in this offense not be able to produce anything even remotely close to a decent season. All of them outside of the top 40 production. So we're leading towards Allen Lazard. We're obviously taking the discount on him and hoping that he's going to be able to outproduce Mr. Old Man Sammy Watkins and Randall Cobb. Moving on, Brandon Aiyuk is the next wide receiver I wanted to mention. Brandon Aiyuk was the bee's knees last season, if we have to just put it in some sort of term. He was the hype machine of the 2021 offseason. But the reason why we had so much excitement about his potential was because, of course, Kyle Shanahan offenses are offenses we want fantasy pieces in. They score a lot of points. And from weeks 7 through 16 of Brandon Aiyuk's rookie year in 2020, he was averaging over 15 fantasy points per game. And in that 7-game span was the number 6 overall wide receiver in fantasy points per game. But then we got into the 2021 year. And for the first 8 weeks of the season, it was as if Brandon Aiyuk was quite literally invisible. He was averaging 4 fantasy points per game and was the number 91 overall wide receiver. Until finally, he somehow, someway won over Kyle Shanahan. And once he did, Kyle Shanahan took him out of the doghouse and allowed him to take over. From weeks 9 through 18, was the number 13 overall wide receiver in fantasy, was the number 18 overall wide receiver in fantasy points per game, with a minimum of 5 games played throughout that span of time. Again, a lot of production from Brandon Aiyuk. And all we've heard this offseason is positive things from both Kyle Shanahan and Trey Lance. All I've seen this offseason is Brandon Aiyuk dominating in practice. Hopefully, he'll elevate and maintain as a top 36 wide receiver. Moving on, let's talk about Hunter Renfrow. Now, Hunter Renfrow last year was a top 12 wide receiver. And a lot of that production was because of his receiving touchdowns. Now, if he's not able to accumulate those receiving touchdown numbers again, I think he had 9 last season, where can we potentially see him landing? Now, we know that Josh McDaniels is the head coach. He's a former New England Patriots offensive coordinator since 2012. We remember the likes of Wes Welker, Danny Amendola, Julian Edelman, Jacoby Myers. We know the legacy of slot wide receivers in New England. And of course, from 2013 through 2019, Julian Edelman, he was averaging 9.6 targets per game. Jacoby Myers last season led the team for the New England Patriots in terms of total targets, 126. So why not Hunter Renfrow? Why not go ahead and continue to litter him with targets? Yes, he's not going to score that many touchdowns. Davante Adams, Josh Jacobs, of course, you still have Darren Waller and Foster Moreau to be goal line threats. Those guys most likely get the job done, but maybe Hunter Renfrow is going to be able to get into that 100 target range. And I went ahead and I looked at the last couple years. Specifically, I looked at last year in more detail. There were 15 teams that had a tight end with 80 or more targets. Only 3 of those teams were able to give 2 of their wide receivers over 100 total targets. That consists of the Cowboys, the Buccaneers, and the Chargers. Why not the Las Vegas Raiders in 2022, allowing Hunter Renfrow to get out of the H tier and probably end up finishing hopefully near G or F by the end of 2022. Moving on, let's talk about Robert Woods. Now, Robert Woods, obviously, like I mentioned prior in regards to the conversation we had about Allen Robinson, was the number 11 overall wide receiver between weeks 1 through 9 of the 2021 season. He was averaging over 12.5 fantasy points per game. He was incredible, all while Cooper Kupp was dominating as the number 1 guy. Now, over the course of Robert Woods' career, he has built consistency and has built a lot of comfort with me. Obviously, I'm a Rams fan, but in the idea that he's going to continue to be a wide receiver that should be in that top 36 conversation. Again, from 2018 through 2020, he was the number 10, 17, and 13 wide receiver. As long as he continues to be the Robert Woods of old, even though he is now going to be in a Tennessee Titans offense that also has Treylon Burks, has Phillips, has Hooper, has Westbrook-Ikhine, also has Derrick Henry, maybe catching the ball a couple times out of the backfield, I still think that Robert Woods should be the primary receiving option. Is he going to be A.J. Brown level of production? Probably not. A.J. Brown scored 23 touchdowns in the last 35 games with Ryan Tannehill. But as long as he's able to get back into that 10 to 12 point range, I think Robert Woods should be a pretty safe draft pick in 2022. Moving on, let's talk about Tyler Lockett. In the same regard that I talked about DK Metcalf, I really do believe that Geno Smith can get the job done at times. I know last season in the games that Geno Smith and Tyler Lockett played together, Geno didn't really pull his weight too much as Tyler Lockett only averaged 8.65 fantasy points per game. We've talked about how Drew Lock, in his first 17 starts of his NFL career, when he's been healthy and not left the game early with an injury, has totaled over 4,100 passing yards and 24 passing touchdowns. There's hope in those two options, but I really do believe Jimmy Garoppolo is going to be the starting quarterback of this team by week 3 against the Atlanta Falcons. This is going to elevate Tyler Lockett. Now, whether or not he sits in the I tier by the end of the season is only a matter of time, but I'm just thinking of Tyler Lockett as an investment. If in fact the Jimmy G transaction doesn't happen, there's no guarantee that he's going to be a top 40 wide receiver. Obviously, he's been able to be far more than that in seasons past, but a lot of that has been contributed to the efforts of Russell Wilson. So hopefully Tyler Lockett can maintain and stay in this conversation, because we do believe there's a lot of talent there, but the quarterback position just has to get the ball in his direction consistently for him to be a great fantasy option for us. Let's move on to Drake London. Obviously, he's dealing with a little bit of an injury this offseason, but when you're going into an offense that no longer has Calvin Ridley, Russell Gage, Tajay Sharp, Lee Smith, or Hayden Hurst, there's going to be 225 available targets for grab. Obviously, those targets last year led to 157 receptions, over 1,500 receiving yards, and 10 touchdowns. Now you get a little bit of a dip at the quarterback position going from Matt Ryan to Marcus Mariota. But hey, Marcus Mariota in his career has always liked to target big-bodied receiving options, whether that has been Corey Davis or Delaney Walker. And that could very easily be the combination of Drake London and Kyle Pitts this season. He's just got to stay healthy, because I've mentioned this in a prior video. Wide receivers over the course of the last 5 years that have been drafted in the top 10 have consistently been top 36 wide receiver options. They just have to maintain that health in order to accomplish that. Moving on, let's talk about our next wide receiver, Chris Godwin. Speaking of health, I don't know when he's going to be available. Prior to his injury, he was the number 8 overall wide receiver in fantasy, averaging 9.3 targets per game and 14.5 fantasy points per game. Obviously, this offense has taken huge steps forward in the last couple years. I mean, with Tom Brady, Chris Godwin has had 20 performances of a top 36 wide receiver standing. That's a 70% rate. As long as this offense continues to be as effective as they have been, we have seen Tom Brady and his slot wide receivers in seasons past, whether it's going back to New England, find a lot of success. So why not Chris Godwin once again? Obviously, the question is whether or not he is back and ready, and he probably won't be on the PUP list, but it doesn't mean he's going to be playing the first 4 games of the season. And with that taken into account, maybe he's not as valuable as some of these other options that could give us immediate success and be just as good in the long run. Moving on, we have DeVonta Smith. Listen, I think DeVonta Smith is a great receiver. I just think when you're talking about the number 2 receiving option, maybe number 3 if Dallas Goedert takes a step forward, of the Philadelphia Eagles offense that threw the ball the least amount of times last season, maybe if they elevate in terms of passing the ball more, we'll see a little bit of opportunity kind of increase for DeVonta Smith. But if it doesn't, and he's going to be relegated to lesser overall targets and have to be the number 2 receiving option, he could still very easily get away with the idea of taking on second cornerbacks, taking on easier matchups. Again, I mentioned it before. This is the easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position going into the 2022 season. This offensive line demands respect and demands teams to stack the box because of the running game that Jalen Hurts and these running backs present every single week. So again, DeVonta Smith should be a top 40 wide receiver. Fingers crossed he's able to accomplish that. Moving on, our final wide receiver for today. To close out today's episode, we have DeAndre Hopkins of the Arizona Cardinals. He is going to be suspended for the first 6 games of the year. He also has a bye week once he returns. So we effectively, from weeks 1 through 16, will only get 9 eligible games from him, assuming he stays healthy. If he's able to come back and be the DeAndre Hopkins of old, the guy that from 2020 through 2021 with a healthy Kyler Murray averaged 14.3 half PPR fantasy points per game, then he is worth every single penny of the selection, of the ADP draft. But if he comes back, if he is, not healthy, if he's not consistent, if Marquise Brown has taken away far too much of the opportunity share, then DeAndre Hopkins is relegated to a far lesser position. But right now, I think he's in that top 40 wide receiver conversation. But the fact that we're only getting 9 eligible games, by the time you get through weeks 1 through 6, you may already be out of playoff contention. If your league is a 12-team league and only 6 teams make the playoffs, you cannot afford to start off slowly. You have to come out firing on all cylinders, and you have to make impact wins early in order to ensure that you are making the playoffs. Now, if you can ensure this, maybe trade for him midway through the season. But if you're looking to draft him early, you've got to have a very strong wide receiver core because you're not going to be able to put him on your injured reserve. You have to have him filling a roster spot, which is going to play a big difference. All right, that concludes our wide receiver tier list for the 2022 fantasy football season. The list did end up accumulating 43 wide receivers, but again, top 40. Do with it as you will. Hopefully this video helps you guys out. If it does, be sure to click the like button down below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. And of course, check out Underdog Fantasy. When you go ahead and sign up today and make a first-time deposit using promo code Andrew, not only will you get a first-time deposit match up to $100, you'll get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings along with a chance to win $50 in the upcoming giveaway Monday, August 29th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time here on the channel. I'll be live streaming. So again, you have to sign up and make a first-time deposit using promo code Andrew between August 25th and 28th to be eligible for the giveaway. 10 people will win $50, a $500 giveaway. Hopefully we'll see you there on Monday night. Either way, tomorrow we have our quarterback tier list video. Hopefully you're excited. And until then, I will see you guys. Peace.